Hi, Melanie. Thank you very much
Hello.
for joining me today and agreeing to talk about your new book, and congratulations on it coming out.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, before we start, I just thought I'd do a bit of an introduction for our viewers so they know a bit more about you. So, Melanie Backe-Hansen is a highly respected historian and author who specialises in researching the social history of houses, streets, and areas. Her expertise are called upon by private homeowners, TV companies, radio producers, magazines, publishers, and she can often be found speaking at conferences and events up and down the country. People may recognise you from Phil Spencer's History of Britain in 100 Homes, but most recently you've acted as a consultant on the wonderful BBC Two series A House Through Time, and you have co-authored the book, which is what we'll be talking about today.
Yes.
So we'll just start with a very big question.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a brief summary of the book and what people will find when they read it?
Yes. Well, to help people, it's essentially the story or the history of the urban house through time. And so I start with an introduction to actually how to research houses and give people some tips on the key sources to go to, how they can do it themselves. So that gets people started and also gives them a bit of a picture about what goes into researching the houses for the TV programme. But yeah, just all the different sources that people can go to if they want to do it themselves, they want to venture into the journey. But then we basically, it's co-written between David and myself. So he did one chapter and I did another chapter, and then they're all sort of merged together. But it tells the story of how we have come from our earliest sort of abodes, and we actually look at sort of Roman houses at the beginning, but actually very much it starts with sort of medieval houses, and how we went from sort of timber framed houses like the Shambles in York through to Georgian terrace, how we went from timber frame to brick or stone, how the rooms developed, but also the impact that different things in our general history had on our houses. So whether that would be war or disease or all sorts of different events throughout our joined history, and then how that impacted the house, but then also how we lived in our houses. And it takes the journey all the way through Georgian to Victorian, and also looks at the different types of houses in the sense that it's not just, the typical middle class Victorian 2 up 2 down or whatever it is, but actually it looks at the lower class housing, slum housing, how people lived during different periods, and then looking at perhaps a grander house and how the rooms might have been laid out, and it takes the journey all the way through to social housing, the post First World War, homes for heroes, then into sort of the suburban home of the interwar period, through to the Second World War, the impact of the bombing raids and the Blitz, and then also the post-war period and the impact that had on housing. So it's quite a journey through our houses. So a lot of people look at it and think, oh, is that just more about the houses in the TV programme? But we do refer to those, and we use the stories that featured in the programme. But it's very much telling the story of all our houses, and so people get a much better idea of their own house and where it fits within the picture of the full history of houses.
And I love the fact that in the book you are just pulling out all these stories from such a wide range of sources. And like for me, that's why I love local history so much, because you can look at these sources and just get so much information out of them.
Yeah.
And it just gives you it gives me a sense of excitement as you're going through and like unpicking these stories as you go.
Yeah.
So I guess you had a lot of that as you were going through both the TV programme and in researching the book as well. What would you say are some of your favourite things about that?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. I think my biggest thing has always been the history of sort of ordinary houses, and I think for many years it's always been a focus on the big grand stately homes and you know, the architectural masterpiece of whatever big house it might be, and also that idea that we like looking at how the other half lived, you know, like National Trust houses or Historic England or, you know, English Heritage. But actually, I love the fact that you can look at sort of the houses of everyone and actually find these amazing stories. And it is actually the experiences of our ancestors and how they lived in houses, and what experiences they had. How did they, you know, how did they go to the toilet when there were no internal bathrooms, or like what was involved, and what impact did the house have on the way they lived, and then vice versa, the way they live have on the house.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of actually venturing into, it's a bit more personal history. People get a better idea of, how their ancestors lived 200 years ago, or and actually the extraordinary stories. I mean, the key thing with the television program, and also in my work as researching houses all over the country, is that you can have a seemingly ordinary looking house but actually find extraordinary stories, and it literally opens the door, pardon the pun, into, you know, a general history, whether that's, you know, the impact on a family in the First World War, whether that was, the controversial issue that was raised in the recent series, about the house actually largely being built off the back of the funds of slavery, off the back of the money that was made off slavery. So it just opens up so many other stories, and our general history and how we've all lived and the impact of different events. And so, it's all that. And I love that avenue into a seemingly ordinary history, but actually you can find extraordinary stories.
And I think when in the archive search room, when we get researchers coming in doing house histories and family history, and they find the address of one of their ancestors, they always, like, almost without fail, people always ask, so how wealthy were my ancestors, or how can we tell from this address more about them? And I mean, obviously the size of a house is an indicator, but whether they owned it or not is sometimes really hard to ascertain, isn't it? So what would you say that what kind of information do you think people can kind of derive from knowing where their ancestors lived? Just having that address as a starting point. What else might you be able to figure out?
Yes, it's actually a really tricky question because, and again, through the program, this is really evident that you could have a seemingly quite large, comfortable-looking house, but actually, through its different stages of history, it's changed. And so it may have started off as a single home for a family and a gentleman. It could have been quite a well-to-do area. But through different events, through changes in the urban environment, to changes in the city that it's situated, that actually it could go downhill quite rapidly. And so you can actually have a seemingly quite nice looking house, but actually it was at a certain time in history, it was divided up and it was lived in by several families. It could have even, the house in Liverpool that's in the programme, it's really clear it was almost in danger of being knocked down because it was literally in a slum area. So it's really tricky. And I think, if people have an address, it can be a bit misleading because we look at it from our 21st century eyes, and we might even go on Google Maps and go, "Oh, that's actually quite a nice little, nice area," or actually that house looks quite nice. It's all done up. But actually 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it could have been a completely different picture. So that's where you need to kind of look at sources. So like the census or rate books or directories, and actually find, what was actually going on, who was living in the house and how were they living in the house. So that's a bit of a tricky question. Yeah.
That's it. And talk about errors. You also sort of go into that in the book as well, because you actually talk about the Devil's Acre, which is coincidentally where Westminster Archives now is.
I know, it's so strange when you think about it.
I got very excited when I got to that. And I guess, you're talking about how people can use general information about an area to understand a bit more about where their ancestors live, because especially if they're living in a poorer area, there's not so much information about specific property records or about their occupation in the property. So I guess, do you want to just talk a little bit about that and how people what they can gather from that area?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, actually, with the looking at local history. And actually, when I research the history of a house, I will always look at the local history. So
Yeah.
you've got to look at a house within its context. So, whether it was impacted because it was part of a former slum area, or whether it was built because of the railways, or or perhaps it was a former fishing village, or whatever it might be. But actually, certainly in Westminster, central London, yes, okay, it's core central London, but it's had its ups and downs, and it's changed, and what kind of people might have lived there, how it's altered over time, and that you can look at maps is probably the key thing, and looking at maps through time, and you can gauge. Ordnance Survey maps probably one of the most obvious. They started in detail from the sort of 1860s and 70s, and then were periodically updated. So you can actually track the development of the area. So from about the 1860s to the 1880s to the turn of the 20th century to, just before the First World War, or just after the First World War. And you can track it all the way up to now. And there's also other key maps. So in the book, we talk about the Charles Booth poverty map, which is a key for showing the different socioeconomic living conditions across London, and that it was color coded. So you had sort of the grand houses of Mayfair were all gold, so basically meaning affluent, very wealthy, all the way through to different stages, to the bottom of the scale, to black, which was effectively extremely poor. And actually Charles Booth it describes it as semi-criminal. It's basically the worst of the worst. So that's a great tool for looking at actually the type of people that were living in an area.
And I guess it's London, and probably most cities in the country are very similar. And like when you do look at Charles Booth's map, you don't get, I mean, some areas are big blocks of the same colour, but sometimes you get really sort of streets on the top of the scale and at the bottom of the scale, and really pretty to each other, don't they? So
it's really, really interesting. And especially London, I think, is quite key for that, because I think there's a lot of other areas kind of perhaps, developed in far more designated areas, the wealthy over here and the poor over here. But London is, especially, I think, when you get the wealthy people living in an area like Mayfair or Belgravia or somewhere, but actually just the street behind are the Mews, which were obviously the former stables and coach houses, and actually that's where the workmen were. That's where it was. And actually, if you think about pre sewage, plumbing, and all sorts, you had all sorts of mess and muck all through there. So it would have stunk to high heaven. But also you had just around the corner, you would have the tradespeople who serviced the wealthy people. So it's really interesting to see how that. And you might not think that now. You walk down the street of Mayfair and think, oh, of course, it's all super wealthy, but actually it was mixed in, which is really interesting.
And I mean, things like, we mentioned a couple of records, which are, I guess, some of your core records for looking at things. But would you say that in the course of all your research over time, has anything ever sort of led you in a very odd direction to sources that you wouldn't necessarily expect to use or find?
It's interesting because you do, and I think with every house you do, basically depending on who the people are that were living there, will lead you on a different journey. So and it's also important to note, I think you mentioned earlier, with actually prior to the 20th century, most people didn't own their own house, so you also get that difference in record between those who owned it and actually those who were living in the house. But it's a key thing to, once you delve into who was there, who were the owners, who were the occupants, you will go on a different journey with every single house. So you could have two houses in the same street and end up using lots of different sources. And that, it's one of those things that actually, if you're really delving and you really want to get to who people were or what was going on or how did it change hands at that time or what was going on. And you do. I was just thinking, there's diaries and letters, if you can find those, are really, key. But also different sort of military records to try and piece together someone's history that way. All sorts. I actually had a house in Soho, which was a bit of a tricky one because it's a fascinating house. It's Kingley Street, just so parallel to Carnaby Street. And it turns out, and we knew this from the story of a former resident, that actually it was a brothel. And it was owned by a notorious sort of gang of thieves. It was the Messina brothers, and this was in the sort of 30s and 40s. So trying to find the records for something like that is really difficult, because they're not going to be recorded in official records, because they're dodgy, and they're money laundering, brothels, prostitutes, violence, and all sorts. So it was actually really tricky delving into the names of the owners. Interestingly enough, for that one, I found a collection in the National Archives which referred to the ownership around that time, about the 40s and 50s. But they can't find them. So I put in several requests to the National Archives, where are these documents? And to this day, they've not found them. So I don't, it's one of those things you start thinking, did they disappear on purpose? Did they, so you just know, like, all sorts of things. So that was one of the cases of, actually, I found potential sources out of my usual remit, but I didn't actually get to view them because I don't know. I just, it's who knows what happened to these records. So, yeah, it's the current owner still delving into the story. She actually hopes to write a bit of a book about it, because she knew the former owner, who had been a prostitute for these, brothers. But yeah, so that's the sort of thing. So you can also find brick walls where actually the sources have disappeared. So you just never know what journey you'll end up on.
And I guess every archive has its different strengths for the different geographical areas, and some records that you would expect to find. I mean, it's just the nature of archives. You don't always have the records that you'd expect to survive, or where you expect to find them. Even.
Absolutely.
But I guess from your point of view as a researcher, what would you say the strengths in the Westminster collections are for our Westminster researchers?
Yeah, actually Westminster's great, and I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you. I mean, it's central London, so that's another thing where they're just far more records for the centre of the capital. But yeah, the survival of records is great, because particularly I'm thinking rate books, which actually go back to sort of actually it goes late 17th century, I think, in some cases. So that information is priceless, and I think to be able to trace the history back as far as the late 17th century through the rate books is great. And also the rate books that survive are fairly consistent, like, as you say, in some areas, you might find, I don't know, 1732, but then there's a big gap to 1780 or something, and so actually you just never know. But I've found that the rate books have been great. I did actually a house it's called Exeter Court, but it's actually in one of the little streets behind the National Gallery. So it's literally smack bang in the middle of London, right, literally the middle. And it has been there since the late 17th century. So to be able to piece together all that information from the rate books was brilliant. And then, of course, matching it with things like directories. Another thing Westminster's great at is the court directories. So as well as the London or the Kelly's directories, which also feature quite a fairly full collection, the court directories, which were produced for the season, for those who are coming into London for the season. So it looks at people who were actually moving in and out of houses quite swiftly. So they might have only been there for 3-5 months. So if you're looking at places like Belgravia or Mayfair, where that's obviously the key sort of demographic of people coming from their country house and they're coming into London for the season. So the court directories are really great for that, and there's a good collection there. But yeah, so many. There's also things like drainage plans. I think a lot of people it always makes me laugh, because I think drainage plans really does not sound very exciting, but
actually people ask us and they say, oh, can we see some building plans? And we say, oh, we've got the drainage plans. And we're like, oh, we don't want to see those. And I was like, no, they're really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Off-putting, but I mean, that's what they are. You can't change
Yeah. But for the history of a house, that's brilliant. So actually, whether it was because it was being changed into a business, maybe it was residential and now it's being fitted out for a business, or yeah, perhaps it was full residential house in 18th, 19th century, but in the 1920s, they're putting in the first internal bathroom. So
Yeah.
actually it's, and I find that really, really interesting. So there you are. But Westminster has a good collection for that. And a lot of other London boroughs, they just don't have that. I think Kensington has another good collection, but a lot of the others, yeah, they're a bit sketchy. So it just depends. So I think across the board, Westminster's great for all the key house history sources. So whether that's electoral registers, also like ephemera and pamphlets and photographs and images, and so there's that, and a lot of the other areas might not have nearly as much for that. So yeah, I'm not just saying it because of you, but actually Westminster do have a very good collection. Yeah,
I think our images, even though we don't have an image for every house or every road even, the way that collection in particular has been developed over time is really focused on architectural history. The South Westminster bit, Old Westminster as it were, unfortunately it means that we don't have quite so much social history captured in the collection. But it's for building historians, it's great.
It's funny because actually, again, I was doing a house in Mayfair in Albemarle Street, and I found the Westminster collection had the photographs of the bombed house next door. And then I also found the air raid warden reports and the bomb damage map. So actually, that was a fantastic picture of, like, I was researching this house here, but actually next door, I actually had the visual image of the impact of a bomb. And as it happened, that 2 bombs fell, one right in front of that house and one sort of on that house, within a month of each other, but it missed the house that I was researching. So it was really bad luck for the house next door, but but it was really interesting because I had all that information, and it was, it's such a key snapshot of 20th century history. So yeah, there's a great collection.
And I guess as well, with that example, it gives you a sense of what it must have felt to be in that house at the time. You've got the houses both sides of you, being destroyed, and it must have been a very, it's that balance between being relieved it wasn't you, but also a lot of anxiety, I imagine. From
And you see that those photographs are, they show everything, like it literally completely destroyed the house, and you've got the house on the other side, you've got the sort of skeleton, the scars effectively, and it's, and also there were some other photographs that showed a bit more of the street, and things like the signs to the nearest shelter, the sort of roadworks that were going on, because actually one of the bombs hit smack bang in the middle of the road and caused a problem with obviously the water and gas supply and things like that. So it really, and that was just one bomb in London, when you think of actually all the bombs that fell, it gives you a snippet of what it was like. So yeah, very interesting.
Excellent. And finally, no pressure at all on the Westminster side, but in terms of all the stories that you've uncovered in your Westminster time, obviously I don't know if you can beat the Soho example.
Yeah, but, it's quite a good one. Yeah.
What other sort of are your favourite stories that have come out of your work in the area?
Yeah, it is. I mean, as I say, Westminster's quite fortunate because you've got everything from Soho to Mayfair and Belgravia to Marylebone and, like everything that's going on. But I have actually done or researched 2 houses in Queen Anne's Gate, which is actually not far from the archives. So it's just on the other side of St James's Park tube station. And it's a renowned street because it's got a lot of Queen Anne door canopies. So a lot of the time, if you find yourself down Queen Anne's Gate, you can look down the street and it architecturally looks impressive. Although I should add that a lot of those door canopies are replacements and they're not original, but there you are. But it's now also one of the most expensive streets to live in London, because it's literally to the right. It looks over, one side looks over St James's Park, and then just down the road you've got obviously Whitehall, Westminster Abbey, the whole. Anyway, But so I did one of the later houses, which was actually a replacement of some earlier houses. And interestingly, it was on the site of the Royal Cockpit. So actually that was fascinating, because there was all this story about gambling and around fighting cockerels, and like actually it was one of the most popular gambling spots in the centre of London, and so you got all that going on. Then there's this replacement house that was built at the sort of turn of the Victorian period, but it was fascinating because it ended up being occupied by a load of different engineers and architects, and actually a lot of the engineers that were responsible for the underground, including James Greathead, sorry, just get my names right, and he created the Greathead Shield, which basically allowed the building of the tube as a so things like the Piccadilly line and which were actually going much deeper underground, and also others that were responsible for railway construction, and the Forth Rail Bridge in Scotland, and it actually was fascinating because there was such a collection of famous, notable engineers and architects. So that was brilliant. But then I researched another house a bit further down, which was one of the earlier built. Literally turn of the 18th century, so from turn of the 18th century, so it was I think completed about 1704, and it had a whole long list of famous names, and largely famous for the period, so a lot of them were notable in their time, but all sorts of stories came out, because there was a widow and her daughter who ended up being basically a very wealthy heiress, the daughter, and she was courted by Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, who happened to live down the road with his dad, and so actually there was this, and I found all these letters from Jeremy to his brother and his father about this daughter, and how he didn't find her attractive to begin with, but then he found out how much money she was going to get, so she became far more attractive in his eyes. So there's all that going on. And then in the 20th century, after the First World War, the house became the home of the head of MI6, and it connected through to a house in the parallel street, which was the head office for MI6. And there was this, a lot of the records say it was a secret tunnel, but there was effectively a walkway between the two buildings. So, you wouldn't know who was actually going in, and it was all very secretive. And it ended up being the home of the head of MI6 through to after the Second World War. So actually that whole interwar period where you've got communism, you've got the rise of Nazism, you've got all sorts going on. Then you've got the lead up to the Second World War. It was where the SOE, the Secret Operations Executive, actually had a base to begin with before they became official in the Second World War. And also I'm just trying to think of the name. The organisation that became what Bletchley Park, and those who uncovered the Enigma code. And so actually it all happened in this house in the interwar period, and then the beginning of the Second World War through to post Second World War and the Cold War, and then so actually this fascinating story unravelled. So Queen Anne's Gate's probably it's got so much history, and actually there's a number of blue plaques. It's had its fair share of famous residents. So yeah, that's probably my key Westminster street. Yeah.
Oh wow! I mean, I'm gonna have to look into more on that street.
Yes, yeah, and there's still so much more. That's just two houses, there's still more.
That's it, and I guess it's the point that it's it could be any house. You literally don't know who has lived in there beforehand, or their stories are. And even if, I mean, one of the things, sorry, I said it was the last question and I'm going on.
Okay.
One of the things that in the book, I mean, you touched on it before, is that it doesn't have to be a big house. It doesn't have to be a grand house. It can literally be any house, any age, because there's a history not only to the area, but a history to the land, to the plot, to the story around the house. And, everyone's got something to research then, haven't they? It's not a subject reserved for a certain group of people. It is a very accessible subject for anyone.
Oh yeah, 100%. And as I said at the beginning, I'm very much for that actually, in a way, moving away from the big stately homes. I mean, yeah, they can be, nice Mayfair townhouse is always going to be interesting. There's always going to be something going on. But yeah, I've done actually a number of mansion blocks and court, apartment blocks in Westminster as well. And so everything from perhaps the Peabody estate that was built on the site of Devil's Acre much later. And so actually you can look into actually how social housing developed at the turn of the 20th century and how that there's so much to unravel with that, and the history of what was on the site before. So you can look at the Devil's Acre, you look at the way Victoria Street was built through the slum to try and get rid of it, and there's all sorts going on there. But then as I say, I've done a number of courts and mansion blocks where you kind of think, oh well, it's just the 1930s apartment block, but actually you can find out so much information about the individual occupants of the flat and the people that came and went, but what was on the site before. And actually there's so much looking at any kind of house, and I love that. So across the country I've done lots of different ones with literally little cottages, which you'd think, well, there's not really much there, but like say for example in Norfolk I did a house which is literally a 2 up 2 down cottage, but it ended up being by one of the few survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. And actually there's a fascinating story about this man who survived, and he wrote a journal of his time. He ended up being nursed by Florence Nightingale, the whole story. And it was literally a labourer's cottage in the middle of a small village of Norfolk. So and the same applies in the middle of London. So you can actually get 2 up 2 down small terraced house, but you just don't know what stories you can find. So there's so much you can research.
Yeah. Okay, I will make this the last question now. But I guess what would you say are the top sort of 3 tips that you'd give to people who are embarking on starting to look at their home?
My top tips are generally, the first tip, actually very important, is actually to work backwards in time. And I think a lot of people, they don't really understand how that's meant to work, but they want to jump straight into when it was built, which makes sense. But actually, in order to make sure you're researching the right house, it's much better to work backwards in time from what you know. So whether that's your own time in the house, or perhaps you've got land registry, title register, and you've got details of its more recent history, and then trace it backwards. And that's one of the key things, is house numbers and names change, and they often change several times. I did a house in Covent Garden many years ago, and it had, I think it was 4 different house numbers. Oh, wow. So if you want to, so if you're thinking, oh, I'll jump back to 1820 when it was first built, or whenever it was, but actually it had a completely different house number. So you can end up researching the wrong house and get very confused. So it's easier to work backwards, and that's also where you'll spot the changes. So that's probably tip number 1. I mean, there's 2 tips in there, but I'll take 2 tips. Working backwards is the key tip. But also, if you're, I think probably look, especially while we're in lockdown, hopefully not for too much longer, but if you start with maps is a key one. And there's a variety, especially for central London, Westminster, there's a whole range of different maps. And so obviously the Ordnance Survey ones I mentioned, there's also a website called Layers of London, which actually is really good for, literally it's the layers of different maps of a site. So that could be a great starting point for people if they're just delving into their house, in Westminster. And it takes you back quite a long way. So that would be really helpful. I'd say, I mean, I'm quite methodical about it. So I in order not to miss anything, I'm quite methodical. Basically taking it step by step is another key point. So as well as, avoiding trying to jump back into the first, when it was first built, but actually, just taking it step by step. Because you can, if there are gaps in the records, or the house number changes or something, or something's not quite right. If you're taking it methodically, it's a bit easier to spot the where things change effectively. So and also spot the interesting stories.
You
So
don't
yeah, that's probably
the best bit.
yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time and for taking part in this. And hopefully we'll be seeing you very soon back at the archive.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Thank you, Mel.
That's right.